We're going to start now by talking about advertising objectives. This is probably the single most important consideration when you're doing TikTok advertising. It's the single most important consideration when you're doing Facebook advertising, LinkedIn advertising, Twitter advertising. And the TikTok interface gives us roughly the same types of options as these other social media advertising channels do. Now, not only is this the most important consideration, but it's also the first consideration that you have. And one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen in marketing over the past 12 years is that marketers jump straight to strategy and straight to objectives before they know where it is they're trying to get to. That's your objective. You need to know how you're going to measure success at the end of the day of your campaign, and you do that first by deciding what the objective is. And one of the biggest problems that marketers run into is that they start running campaigns and experimenting and sort of throwing things out there. And at the end of the day, they're not even able to determine whether it was successful or not because they didn't even decide from the get-go how they were going to measure success. So the objectives really help us focus and orient ourselves around things that we can optimize for the results that we're looking for. So let's take a look at what those precise objective options are. The first is reach. Show your ad to the maximum number of people. Now, reach is an objective that a lot of people don't focus on, particularly startups. But we're going to talk later in the course about why there's tons of empirical evidence to suggest that this may actually be the single most important objective, especially as you're scaling up your business. Now, the other option that we have here is traffic. Send more people to a destination on your website or app. App installs. Get more people to install your app. May be applicable if you're selling a mobile app on Google Play or through Apple products. Video views. Get more views and engagement for your video ads. Lead generation, very important if you're selling services or you're selling anything in the business-to-business sphere, whether it's products or services. Collect leads for your business or brand. Community interaction, get more page follows or profile visits. And then lastly, conversions, drive valuable actions on your website or app. Conversions is going to be very important in some context, particularly when you're dealing with very short-term sales cycles. So things where people buy right away on impulse. Things like e-commerce products, clothing, perhaps consumables like food or cosmetics, these types of things. You may be focused on conversions, especially if you're looking for short-term results. If you're more interested in long-term results and big growth and you're a little more patient, then you're going to focus more over here on the reach campaigns. And if you're somewhere in between, you may mix in some of these central objectives. So I want you to spend a lot of time thinking about these objectives because these are the high-level decisions you need to make before you jump into creative decisions and tactical advertising decisions. Now, before you jump into the objectives, you may notice that the interface you're seeing in the TikTok's ad manager may look different from mine. So if you look at mine here, you see advertising objective, and you have three bundles of objectives. The first is awareness. The second is consideration, and last is conversion. Now, currently, the only one that has multiple options is under the consideration category. Now, if you do not see these, it may be because you're in simplified mode. I recommend going into custom mode because that's going to give you the most flexibility and that's going to give you the most options. The question is, which objective or objectives are we going to use with our TikTok ads? And to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to guess. I'm not going to just use my intuition. What I'm going to do is I'm going to rely on research. And there's tons of research showing how to allocate your budget optimally, how to expend your energy in marketing depending on what type of company you are and how big your company is. But before we do that, we need to understand how researchers look at marketing communications. And we look at some of the best research, what we see is they split marketing communications basically into two different categories. So the first category is what a lot of people call brand. So this would include things like awareness marketing, reach campaigns, things that go very broad, this is also what you might classify lately as demand creation. And the second cluster of marketing communications would be what we call activation. Now, in consumer marketing, the term that we often use is called performance marketing. So it's things where we're very precise in measuring the return on investment of what we're doing because we're very interested in short-term results and not necessarily long-term scalability. This might also be what you would call demand capture. So you're capturing the demand in the form usually of sales or revenue or business-to-business pipeline revenue. Some people might, in the business-to-business world, call this demand generation. They might call it account-based marketing, or they might just use the term lead generation. So basically, we have these two clusters of activities. We have brand types of marketing, which is more interested in long-term and more interested in scale. And then we have activation, which is more about short-term results. The scale is smaller. The time scales are also smaller. And then what we can do is we can classify the different objectives in TikTok as to whether they might be considered brand or activation. Now, TikTok gives us three categories: awareness, consideration, and conversion. But the best research that's available based on thousands of data points only splits it into two. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at these and see which bucket they would fit under. And some of these are judgment calls, so it's not completely black and white, and it kind of depends on how you're doing it. But I'm going to take my best guess based on what I think would apply in most situations. So when you're doing a reach campaign, generally speaking, this is what we would call brand marketing. It's wide targeting, it's focused on long-term results, and it's focused on big impact. So not just short-term impact, but more big scalable impact. Traffic and these other consideration objectives we'll get to in a second. But what we could say is the first cluster is brand marketing, and then at the very bottom, conversions is activation. Conversions is generally things that are going to either be sales themselves, so they're buying on your website, for example, or on your landing page, or it's going to be things that are very closely tied to sales. So things like request a free consultation, request a price quote on this automobile or this business-to-business service. So it's pretty much black and white that those would be brand and these would be activation. Now in the middle, it gets a little murkier. So when you're driving traffic to your website or your app, you could be doing that because you want them to convert. Now, generally, that wouldn't be the case. And the reason is because we can use something like lead generation to get people to convert within TikTok itself. So sending people to your website to convert often doesn't really make that much sense. So I would tend to classify this more as brand marketing because it's more about educating people and getting them more familiar and aware of your product and your brand than it is about necessarily getting them to reply or buy now. However, there are cases where this would be considered activation. Now, if app installs, I would consider more of an activation thing. You want people to actually install the app, not just think about it, not just talk about it, not just become familiar with it, but actually use it. Video views tends to be more about brand marketing or awareness marketing. You want people to watch the video. You want them to be persuaded perhaps to buy your brand or to buy your product, but the video isn't generally the type of thing that is optimal for getting people to actually buy. When you want people to buy, you might use something like an image or a cold email or perhaps the lead generation objective. So if we look at the lead generation objective, what we can do is get people to convert within TikTok itself. And people are far more likely to submit your lead form, your lead capture form, your survey, whatever it is that you're doing, if they don't have to leave TikTok to do it. So I would definitely call this an activation play when you're doing lead generation. Now, community interaction, on the other hand, when you're trying to get engagement on your ads, this is probably more focused on brand. You're trying to generate word of mouth. You're trying to get a discussion going. You're trying to perhaps build a community. That's more about brand marketing. So you can see what I've done here is I've taken all these different objectives that TikTok gives us, and I've split it into two groups. One focused more on long-term, brand, And then the other focus more on short-term salesy type activities. So these would be the activation ones. And we can see that basically there are three ones that are focused on activation and short-term results: conversions, app installs, and lead generation. So if you're interested in short-term results, well, it may not be the best to do something like a reach campaign or a community interaction campaign. Now that we've classified the TikTok campaigns and the TikTok campaign objectives associated with those campaigns, we can start deciding how we're going to spend our money on TikTok. And one of the first considerations when it comes to allocating your budget is thinking about whether you're in business to business, you're selling to businesses, or you're business to consumer, you're selling directly to consumers. Now, with business to consumer, you tend to spend more money on brand marketing. And the reason for this is largely because the activation is very simple. When somebody walks into a store to buy an item, it's not that complicated. They don't generally need to talk to a salesperson, except in certain cases, like maybe when they're buying a car or they're buying a house. So you don't generally need to invest a lot in activation when it comes to business to consumer. So typically more money, 60%, is spent on brand marketing with business to consumer. This is the optimal allocation based on empirical evidence. And then the optimal spend would be 40% of your budget on activation. Now, in some cases, a lot of companies actually have it backwards. So let's consider e-commerce, for example. A lot of e-commerce companies are going to spend all of their money on activation. So direct conversion, are people buying as soon as they get to the website? But what the evidence actually shows is that in a case like e-commerce, it's even more tilted towards brand activation or brand marketing as the optimal spend. The reason is because of things like e-commerce, because of the internet, it's actually very, very easy to buy things. Easier than it was in the past. So what that means is that companies should actually be spending more money on brand marketing and less money on activation, because the activation is just so easy to self-serve these days. So there are things that are a bit paradoxical and opposite to what companies are actually doing out there. Now, when you're in business to business, you need to spend more on activation in most cases because sales purchases are more complex. Your buying groups are bigger, contract sizes are bigger. So generally you need more involvement from a salesperson. You need more education that's going to get people into the sales funnel. So that means you should be spending about 54% of your budget on demand generation type of activities and only 46% on brand marketing types of activities. Now, what do we actually see in the real world? An allocation that is way too tilted towards activation, and not nearly enough on brand marketing. And I'm talking specifically here about business to business. Now, the classification as to whether you're marketing to consumers or businesses is only one consideration when it comes to budget allocation. The other is the size of your company. Now, a lot of small companies are going to spend too much time on brand marketing awareness type activities and not enough on short-term things that are going to be closely tied to revenue, i.e. activation activities. So if you're a small company and you're doing TikTok advertising, you should be spending the majority of your budget on things that are going to get results. So those are going to be objectives like lead generation and conversion, because those are very closely tied to revenue. And if you're not generating revenue now as a small business, you may not even be around next year, even if things like long-term brand marketing were effective. So you do need to focus on activation. And that means that as a first-year company, putting 65% of your budget towards activation is generally the optimal balance. Now, if you get into early growth stage, the balance actually shifts. So now you should be spending even more, the majority of your budget, on brand marketing. As you become a mature brand, you should be spending 62% of your activity on brand marketing. And then when you're a leader, a brand leader, then 72% of your time on brand activity. So you see that there's a shift that happens. When you're very, very small in your very early stage, you need to invest more in activation, short term demand generation, performance marketing, but then it quickly shifts and you need to start investing the majority of your budget in awareness or demand creation. Now, often it's a bit misleading because when people are looking through their attribution data, they're going to see that, all of our customers are coming from organic search. But why are they searching? And particularly, why are they searching for your brand? It's because they heard of it somewhere. They heard of it through word of mouth. They heard of it through a podcast. They heard about it perhaps through advertising that you're running. So a lot of people think that it's the SEO that's driving the customers, but that's not necessarily the case. Often what it really is it's the brand marketing activities that are hidden and often more difficult to trace. So as you start to set up your campaign, you're going to set your budget. So here I've set reach as the objective, and then you're going to set some sort of limit on the budget. Now, within TikTok, by default, it's going to say no limit, but that's a very easy recipe for things getting out of hand and spending too much money. So instead, what I would do is I would set a daily budget, perhaps of $50, or a lifetime budget for the entirety of the campaign. And that might be, say, $500 or $1,000. But I wouldn't rely on the default here of no limit. As you're setting up your campaign, you need to make the decision as to whether you want to do split testing. Split testing is a very powerful device. What you could do is you could send half of your audience to one variation of your campaign and half of your audience to another variation, and then see which one outperforms. I'm very critical of this type of testing. I think it is very effective, but I think it's grossly overused. Now, the first reason that I think it's overused is because it's basically a crutch. People don't want to make strategic decisions about what direction to go. So they just say, I'll just take my hands off the wheel and I'll say whatever the data says. The problem here is that you need to be strategic and you need to make trade-off decisions, and that's going to lead to better marketing. If you're just kind of tweaking and doing little tests here and there, you're not really focused on impact. You're focused on optimization. And I'm much more interested in absolute performance, serious impact, than I am with conversion rate optimization, which is sort of minor tweaking in a lot of cases. So when you're first starting with TikTok ads, I wouldn't do split testing at first. I would say once you get a little bit of a grasp on it, you can start doing testing. And I would think about what you're testing. I would try to test major types of things rather than minor tactical creative decisions, more like what kind of offer are you giving? Is it a free consultation? Is it a free trial? And more macro considerations instead of what most are we going to use this or that. The problem with it has a series of huge scales. So companies like Google are going to do that type of optimization testing, because when you scale that across billions, when you're a smaller company, A/B not results, particularly when it's just at the tactical level. Now, one thing that you do need to pay special attention to with TikTok is special categories, things like housing, employment, and credit. When you set up your TikTok account, it's also going to ask you what category you're in. I've experienced some friction here that I didn't experience with other social media advertising. Be careful. So for one of my ads, city education, so I was not able to run ads in countries like Korea, for example, without doing some paperwork. So don't just do this randomly. Make sure you know what category you're in, because TikTok will push back on you if you try to do something that isn't 100% compliant. Now, another decision you have to make is whether you want to rely on TikTok to do campaign budget optimization. Probably the best choice to go with in the beginning, and you can just toggle this on right here. In the next section, what we're going to do is talk about targeting. I'm going to walk you through how to set up a campaign and work with split testing. Here I am in the TikTok Ads Manager, ads.tiktok.com. I'm going to click this red button right here for Create. I'm going to select an objective. For this example, I will choose Reach to reach as many people as possible. I'm not going to declare any categories. I'm going to toggle this on to create a split test As for the budget, I'm going to on-check no limit, and I'm going to put in a budget of $50. Hit continue. I'm going to peek into the advanced settings here, and I'm going to see that I can allow user comments, video downloads. That's fine, so let's close that. Go down to the audience. I don't have a custom audience list for this demonstration. Demographics, Canada is the default. Instead, what I'm going to do is I am going to check off everywhere that I can. So Korea, yes. Now, it is going to be a problem if they don't speak English, but what I'm going to do is target based on language later on to narrow it down to the people that speak English in these regions. So I've checked off every region. You can see that there's not a lot. I'm going to target all genders, all age groups. Language, this is where I'm going to narrow it just to English. And for interests and behaviors, we could put in something here, browse through what the options are. So we have education, food and beverage. Let's try financial services maybe. We could select people with foreign exchange transactions. Device, I'm going to leave that without any specifications. Daily budget, let's try $21. $20 is the minimum, US dollars. I'm going to leave this at the default. I'm also going to leave these at the default. I think a frequency of 3 per week is perfectly fine. Bid strategy, I will also leave that the same. I'm going to take a peek here into the advanced settings. We see that we don't really have any options here. We have to go with CPM and standard, so let's close that. I'll hit next. This is where we see the creative for the ad, single video. What I'm going to do is I can upload a video if I want it to, but since I've already done that, instead what I'm going to do is choose from the library. I'm going to check off this video that I already uploaded, hit confirm. I'm going to add some text. I'll say something like exclusive marketing coaching. I could add an add-on for something like a coupon or a countdown timer. I'll talk about that later in more detail, but for simplicity, let's just leave it as it is, and I'll hit continue. So what we've done is we've created a control group, and we can decide what we want to split test on. So we could split test on targeting, which would probably be one of the most important things. We can split test based on creative, which is what we'll do for this demonstration because that's the split testing people are most familiar with. And we can also split test based on bidding and optimization, which is great because that kind of capability, for example, is not available in LinkedIn. So you have to do some roundabout ways to be able to test certain variables like that. So TikTok really gives you some excellent avenues for testing. It also provides you this estimated testing power. So it says that given the budget and schedule, it is sufficient. Now, we also need to know what outcome we're measuring to compare. And since we selected the reach campaign, it's going to be cost per 1,000 people reached. If you had selected something else like lead generation, the key metric is going to be different. You can see the daily budget here. And then these two tabs are very important. So we have the test and we have the control. So you can see that the control group has already been created and can't be modified. And we can take a peek in here to see what it looks like. Now the test group also looks identical to the control group. However, that's pretty meaningless. So what we need to do is we need to make a change. So what I'm going to do here is I could just change the text, but I'd rather do something more dramatic. So I am going to change the video by hitting update from library, and I'm going to go with a different video, and I'm going to hit confirm. So now we have two creatives in the test and the control, and the only thing that changed is the video. So the text is still the same, everything else is the same, and what we're testing on is the creative. So I'd hit complete. And it's creating the split test. And once it's completed, we'll be able to navigate here. And this is where you will see the little experiment icon, the flask, to show that This is, in fact, a test that's being done. The number one consideration that I talked about was getting the objective right. Once you have the objective and you have an idea of the end result that you're looking for, the next thing is the strategy. And in most cases with marketing, the most important strategic decision is who you're targeting, the target market. So let's deep dive into the different options that we have within TikTok. Now, the first thing is geographic targeting. TikTok doesn't have the same broad geographic targeting that is available on other social platforms. So often what I would do is I would just check off every single country that's available. Make sure you go through here to see which countries are available. There's not really much point in doing a search because there's a limited menu anyways. But some considerations would be, can you legally sell in their country? I would say language is a factor, even though you could set the language later. I would also tend to think that going broader would be better than going narrower, just because you may not get the same reach that you would achieve with something like Facebook. So check off the relevant regions and countries. Now, the big consideration is the audience targeting, which is the part that I'm particularly interested in. Now, the problem with a lot of online advertising, and this is an issue with TikTok, it's an issue with Twitter, it's an issue with Facebook, YouTube to some extent, perhaps LinkedIn to some extent as well. There are a lot of fake accounts out there. There are a lot of bots out there. There's a lot of metrics that you can't really rely on. So you may get results that say you got 1 million views, but were those real people with real accounts? Often they're not. That's just the reality of the current state of affairs with digital advertising. Now, because it's somewhat dishonest, I hope that there is regulation implemented to help restrict this kind of false data, because you're paying for results that really aren't there. So one of the ways to avoid this is to go with narrow targeting, and perhaps the most precise narrow targeting that you can use is the audience options. And this is where you would go to something here like include, and then over to the right, TikTok gives you the option to add an audience. So this is where you would do something like importing a list. So you may have like a customer list or a database where you can add the people, the individuals, the companies, et cetera, that you want to target. And you can also use it to exclude. So for example, if you don't want to target your current customers, you can exclude them here. So audiences is the most powerful, but it's also the most difficult because it means you have to build a custom audience to target. And it's not as easy as just sort of checking off what people's interests are. But as a general rule, I would say that I would avoid negative targeting with social media advertising in general if it makes sense to go with custom targeting. Now, one of the limitations with custom targeting, though, is that you often can't achieve the reach that you want. But if you do have a database of all the buyers in your category, then you should be using audience targeting and not something like interest targeting. So what we can do is we can go into TikTok Ads Manager under Assets, and we can create an audience. And TikTok gives us two different options. There's a custom audience, and then there's a lookalike audience to expand. Now, lookalike audiences can be nice. So you can do people that are similar to your customers, people that are similar to your sales qualified leads if you're in business to business. So people that look like excellent prospects for your product. The problem with lookalikes is that it works better when you're dealing with scale and you already have something to start out with. A custom audience may be something that you would use earlier on because you may have a database you can work with, but you don't necessarily know who among them are going to become buyers that to be able to create a lookalike audience that's meaningful. So if we go into custom audiences, TikTok gives us a number of different options. So there's a customer file, upload a customer file to match your customers with people on our platform. The matches will be used to create an audience. We have app activity, create a list of people who downloaded your app, if you have that list, or took specific actions such as making a purchase. Lead generation, create a list of people who viewed or submitted an instant form in a lead generation ad. So if you've already been running TikTok ads and you see who's clicking the form, then it would make sense to use this. But again, early on, not really that feasible. Engagement, create a list of people who saw, clicked, or engaged with your current content. The problem with this type of audience, and I'm not trying to completely discourage you from using it, is that people who engage aren't necessarily people who are going to buy, and people who engage may not be real people. They may be bots that are designed to flood the ecosystem but not have any validity to them. Next, we could use website traffic. Use TikTok Pixel to create a list of people who visited or took specific actions on your website. So perhaps they visited your pricing page, or perhaps they submitted a consultation request, something like that. So list targeting. So when you go in here, and what I did here is I just hit customer list. You can simply upload something like a CSV or a TXT file. And then what TikTok will do is it will go and try to match and target those individuals that you uploaded. TikTok also gives us demographic targeting. So we can choose whether we're targeting male or female. We can choose among these different age brackets. So no limit, 13 to 17, 18 to 24, 55 plus. And we can decide which languages to target. My general rule is that demographic targeting like this is not really that helpful. Now, it is helpful if your product is specific. So for example, you're selling lingerie or you're selling men's grooming products. So in this case, yeah, you only want to target male or female. Now, whether somebody's 33 versus 54, does that really matter when you're selling something like consulting services? No. Usually the variables that matter more have to do with how they're using the product, how they're receiving value, maybe the type of company that they're in, maybe the particular value proposition that resonates with them, or what the job to be done is. So I generally go pretty broad with demographic targeting, except in niche cases. Now, as for language, I almost always try to restrict the language to English because I don't want people seeing my ad who don't understand it. And now, I mean, you could do this by trying to target specific geographies, but the problem there is I think the targeting gets too narrow. I mean, would my ad resonate with somebody in Singapore who speaks English? Absolutely. I do not need to go with just British countries or countries in Europe and North America. So I like to use the language restriction, and I prefer it to demographic and geographic restrictions. Now, with interest targeting, you have two different options. The one that I generally start with is just a search. So, for example, you may be targeting people that have interested in Rolls Royces because you're selling some sort of Rolls Royce paraphernalia. Well, just do a search for Rolls Royce. Do a search for whatever interest it is. It could be wrestling, or it could be marketing. And then if you don't find what you want, or you want to go broader with interest, then what I would do is I'd just look at the categories. Now, the thing to be careful with TikTok is that there are many different levels of targeting, which is great with interest. So we could see here, if we choose among the options, we have education, travel, financial services, food and beverage, vehicles and transportation, apparel, accessories, news and entertainment, and so on. But if we go specifically in education, well, we can get even narrower. Early childhood and preschool education, primary and secondary education, K-12, and then we can go even narrower and talk about high school tutoring. So you get very, very specific with interest targeting. Now, I'd be careful with this as well, however, because I think interest targeting is quite often wrong. So it's kind of a brute force way of identifying who you're targeting. So just because somebody happened to click one ad about high school tutoring, does that mean they're really interested in high school tutoring? I don't know. And I think social media platforms like TikTok tend to be quite loose with interest targeting because they want you to advertise to many people, and often they're not necessarily the ones that you want to see your ads. So you do some testing there, and don't take this at face value. So we also have behavioral targeting based on what types of videos they're interacting with. So what kind of actions are we looking at here? So we can specify, for example, that they watched certain videos to the end, they like the videos, they comment it, and they share it. Now, something you need to be careful about is if you're trying to target people to buy, you're not necessarily interested in the people that comment. So there's not necessarily a clear correlation there between engagement and purchase. And we do actually see research that that's the case, that people who see ads and don't interact with them are quite often the people that end up buying. They're just not interactors. So be careful with using these types of metrics. And what you can do is you can specify what those that they're interacting with, and you can do a search and say maybe it's marketing videos, maybe it's customer success videos, maybe it's soccer videos or skateboarding videos, whatever is relevant to what you're selling. And then you can choose the time period. So we're talking about 17 days or 15 days, which is a pretty narrow difference. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you search as we did with interest, but you can also do a search for categories, or we can just choose among the menu of options that are available. So things like talents, nature, lifestyle, society, beauty and style, entertainment, culture, education and technology, sports and outdoors, and so on. And then you can go through the many different layers. So something that is particular to TikTok that you want to pay attention to is not missing those subsegments. So there are many different layers of subsegments. So find the ones that are most relevant to you. TikTok also gives us this exciting targeting option that I call influencer targeting. So targeting people based on their interactions with specific types of creators on TikTok. And those creators could be brands or individuals or perhaps companies. And you define how they interact with the creators based on whether they followed that creator or whether they viewed that creator's profile. And you can do a search for different categories of creators. You can also, again, browse through the menu of options that are available. So things like drama, talent, relationship, motivation and advice, daily life, family, do-it-yourself and life hacks, home and garden. So this type of targeting is similar to what you can do with Facebook using a special tool called Leadinforce. What Leadinforce does is it will allow you to target people that follow specific pages, individuals, etc. Facebook, kind of hack that. About this, it bypasses you needing to form a formal relationship with the creator, with the influencer, and you can simply target the people that already follow them yourself. So this disintermediation makes TikTok very efficient if influencer marketing is a sense. Another interesting targeting option that TikTok gives us is based on hashtag interactions. So this is a behavior that they're engaging with within the TikTok platform. So I would go through and make a series of hashtags that you think may be relevant. And I would look at the ones that are pre-popular, basically the text field people are, and you're not just making up ones that nobody searches for. So I put in the example of marketing. You can see here people are searching for marketing tips, marketing 101, marketing TikTok, marketing agency. So that would be another way to define the targeting. So one of the ads is experimenting with different targeting. You're going to go a lot further than experimenting with something like what color your advertisement is, because it's a more important strategic consideration. So are you defining your audience based on creators that they follow? Are you defining your audience based on hashtags within TikTok? Are you defining your audience based on videos that they engage with? I would consider these various options that TikTok gives you and do some experimenting to see where you're getting the pull. Now, the other advanced granular targeting that TikTok gives us is device targeting, which may or may not be relevant for you. Now, if you're only selling an iOS app, this is going to be incredibly important because you're going to be wasting your ads on people that don't even have a compatible device with what you're selling. So we can see different options here: Android, iOS, or just no limit, the operating system versions, the device model, a connection, are they using Wi-Fi, 5G, etc. You can even go down to the specific carriers that they're with. So Bell Mobility, for example, with this example in Canada that I did, TELUS Mobility, Rogers Wireless, device, all different granular options here: Oppo, Samsung, Huawei, Honor, Xiaomi, etc. I would consider these if your product is unique to specific types of platforms. So a mobile app would be a strong example. Gaming would be a good example. But if you're selling something like plumbing or business-to-business software, business-to-business services, then the devices and who their carriers are is not going to be very relevant. Now, the other option that you have with some objectives is what we call automatic targeting. So there's custom targeting, and then there's automatic targeting. So automatic targeting is when it takes your targeting settings according to your advertising objective, the content of your ad, and past campaign data, and more. So you can play around with this, but in general, I would like to have more control over who I'm targeting. And I think the same rule applies when you're on other social media platforms. But if you're trying to scale up, then you may need to explore other targeting options to go broader. Another way that you can go broader with your campaigns is with targeting expansions. So you see that TikTok gives you this little toggle to turn this on and off. What I recommend, particularly when you first start, is to leave this off because you want control over who you're targeting. Often when you're starting out, you'll have a limited budget, perhaps an experimental budget, perhaps it's a startup company that just doesn't have. What you want is proof of concept. You're going to get proof. You have granular control over who you're targeting. But when you're scaling up, this is when I would consider this. So it is enabling targeting expansion to increase your chance of reaching a broader audience and achieving more conversions. Now, I don't think that you're going to get very good targeting expansion when there isn't a lot of data either on your side or in the platform side. So I would consider it, however, if you're really struggling to get the right reach that you want to get the economies of scale going.